What's up, you guys? Just making a quick video here. I know it says it's a live stream. Honestly, I was trying to figure out how to do video, just like record it off my computer, but I couldn't really figure out. So I just decided to use YouTube's live streaming software, and it's just going to be a short video, just a little book review. But the book I am talking about is Alaska by James Michener. And as you can probably tell, it's a pretty thick book. It's about 1,100 pages. And it took me a few months to read this book. I finished reading it probably a couple weeks ago, maybe a month ago. But it's a really good book. And I wrote basically my thoughts down. So I was going to read my thoughts on this book to you, and then we could go more in depth and discuss it. So let's start with what I wrote down. Alaska by James Michener is a story about, well, Alaska. The entire journey spans about 12,000 years, covering the time when the first peoples from Siberia crossed the Bering Land Bridge, and comes all the way up to the year 1991. When I first started to read this book, I was a little suspicious. First of all, the book is a whopping 1,124 pages. That right there is enough to scare away most people, myself included. Second of all, I had no idea who Michener was, so I didn't know if I was just getting one of countless mediocre books that had been written about the state. My fears were quickly assuaged by the introduction by Steve Berry and the long list of 50-plus works written by Michener. To put it lightly, Michener traveled and wrote about nearly everywhere: Alaska, Texas, Colorado, Hawaii, the Chesapeake, Spain, South Africa, Japan, the South Pacific. He even wrote books about space and Judaism. Each one of his books was insanely researched and contained a massive page count. To say he was prolific would be an understatement. Alaska follows this trend of epic historical fiction that spans thousands of years. It's broken up into the following chapters. Chapter 1, The Clashing Terrains. 2, The Ice Castle. 3, People of the North. 4, The Explorers. 5, The Duel. 6, Lost Worlds. 7, Giants and Chaos. 8, Gold. 9, The Golden Beaches of Nome. 10, Salmon. 11, The Rail Belt. 12, The Rim of Fire. Michener manages to weave an engaging narrative across different centuries and dozens of characters. Just when you think he's abandoned a character completely from the narrative, he'll bring them back in a later chapter, at a different time, and under different circumstances. He lets characters live their lives and have their own adventures until he's ready to reintegrate them back into the main narrative. All of this to say that Michener is a master storyteller. His characters are Athapascan, Aleutian, Eskimo, Russian, Japanese, Chinese, Canadian, Norwegian, German, Irish, American, and others that I'm certainly forgetting. In the Railbelt chapter, he tells the story of how America and Canada worked together to connect Canada and Alaska through the Alcan Highway, today known as the Alaska Highway. The inspiration behind this 1,000-plus mile highway was to have a road paralleling the various airstrips constructed throughout the Northwest in order to send airplanes on lease from America to the Soviet Union. Chapter 10 literally tells the story of how salmon go from the Pacific to their mating grounds in interior Alaska, all while continuing to focus on the various human characters trying to make their fortunes on the salmon trade. It took Michener 7 years to publish Hawaii, 4 to research, 3 to publish. This fact alone should be enough to convince people that Michener was a craftsman who cared deeply about his craft. As Steve Berry wrote, "I'm glad Michener published when he did, because the world just doesn't have the patience for 1,000-page epics anymore." That was my brief description that I wrote down. But yeah, that sums up pretty much this book in a nutshell. So James Michener had a very interesting life. He spent some time in the Navy, and then he basically dedicated the rest of his life to being a writer. As you can tell by the list that I read off, he wrote about a lot of places, Japan, the South Pacific, Hawaii. I think in general, his most popular books are Tales from the South Pacific, Hawaii, and other ones focusing on the Pacific. But obviously, he wrote books like this, like Centennial, which is about Colorado. He wrote Alaska, Texas, the Chesapeake. So he was just very interested in different places, the history of those places, their people, their stories, their culture, their literature, and he really weaves all of those aspects into just a very entertaining narrative. And one thing that I really liked about Alaska is even though it took me a long time to read, it really required me to slow down and to be patient. And I think that's something that's kind of lost nowadays, especially with 24-hour news and streaming services and clickbait articles. It's hard to develop the patience and attention span to really sit with something for days and weeks and months at a time and to really become invested in something to the point where you're just kind of thinking about that thing for a long period of time. I know the world is getting faster and faster, and with the ever increasing development of technology, we want things like right away. We want to basically be entertained by one story and then binge it and be done with it, and then move on to the next thing. We don't really take the time as much anymore to be invested in a story for a long period of time and to really sit with the characters and to take your time and to think about, what is the author writing? And I think Michener really uh, does a good job of that. Like Steve Berry was saying, like he probably wouldn't be able to be um, published nowadays just because, you know, how many people have the time or the willingness to read 1,000 pages? And I'm not saying like, oh, look at me, I read this 1,000 page book, because at times it was honestly a struggle. It's not easy to day in and day out come back to the same book when part of me was thinking I could have read 3 or 4 stories in the amount of time it's taking me to read this one story. But I think ultimately, when I got to the end of it, when I finally read the 1,124th page, it felt like a really big accomplishment. It felt like I had done something significant. And I'm not saying that reading a book is necessarily the most challenging thing in the world, but knowing that I have the patience and the persistence to come back to this book again and again and to basically see a story to its conclusion, no matter how distracted I might get, or no matter how many times I might want to just put the book down and move on to a simpler, easier story. Knowing that I was able to basically stick with it until the very end, it was very rewarding. And that's what I would say the main thing I learned from reading Michener. And I think the thing that is important about long form reading is that it teaches you to slow down. It teaches you to become invested in a story. It teaches you to care about characters. It teaches you to have patience and to not be worried about what's coming up in the next week or the next month, or how many or how behind you are on pop culture or that kind of thing. But knowing that for once you were able to invest a large chunk of your time in order to really dive into this story and to get to know its characters and to get to know its peoples and its places, I thought it was just a really rewarding experience. So, not to take up too much more of your guys' time, but I want to see if I can find some quotes that I liked. Ah, here we go. Sorry that took so long. I was just trying to find places that I had highlighted, but this is a good one. So this is from the last chapter. I forget what the character's name was, but basically she was a school teacher in, I want to say Montana, and she basically gets an ad that they're looking for teachers in Barrow, which Barrow is one of the northernmost points in Alaska. It's literally on the Arctic Ocean, um, and it's a small town. I'm not sure what the population is, but literally like 6 months of the year, it's like total darkness, and then obviously that's contrasted with another 6 months where there's what seems like never-ending sunlight. So it's a place of extremes, like much of Alaska. But anyways, this teacher, she goes and she answers this ad in the paper, and she becomes invested in the local community, and she learns about the local Alaskans and kind of the problems that they're going through, and she really wants to help people, but she quickly realizes that there are certain problems in this community that can't be solved by outsiders, and I think that's a common theme anytime you have a character who has really good intentions and wants to sort of save the world and do good and help other people. When they come into opposition with that, and it's oftentimes not like negative opposition, it's just they come into a community that's not their own and they want to change things in that community, but they're not able to because they don't come from that community. And no matter how hard they try, there are certain things about that community that they'll never understand. And so, this part of the book, this teacher, she is essentially coming to terms with the fact that one of her students committed suicide, and it's really difficult for her to know about this. And she notices that these local Alaskans, especially in Barrow, where there's 6 months of darkness in the year, this is a common theme. Suicide and drunkenness are the two things that really weigh on the soul of this community. And so she's upset and she's talking to this man who is a local school teacher. He's not actually native Alaskan, but he, like her, came up to this place and sort of became like one of the natives. Um, but they're like talking to each other, and this is what the quote says. His own children, hearing the commotion, ran from the house and reached his mangled body in time to hear the truck driver telling bystanders. He was dead drunk. He was always dead drunk. And that night, 3 nights ago today, his wife shot herself. Drunkenness and suicide are the heritage we have given the Indians as a consequence of our laws in contiguous America. Do not reproduce those laws in Alaska. And actually, now that I think about it, yes, I believe this is a conversation between one of the locals and a lawyer who comes to this community. And basically, the lawyer, uh, he ends up marrying the teacher. Basically, the lawyer was a young guy. I think he was like Harvard or Yale educated, and he was married uh, first when he was like in his 20s, and that ended in a divorce. And then he goes up to Alaska, and he starts working for one of the oil companies as a lawyer and sort of bringing laws to Alaska where none existed before. So he's kind of like cutting his teeth in this new environment. And so he ends up meeting this teacher. They fall in love and they get married. It's actually interesting. I think the way he kind of wins her over is he comes up to Alaska like many people looking for adventure, and he enters into the Iditarod, which the Iditarod is 1,000-mile dog sled race through Alaska. It happens every year. It's like very famous, and it's like an intense trial. It's like this really intense physical event. Because you're riding sled dogs through the Alaska wilderness, and it's blistering cold. It's one of the coldest places in the world. So like you have to prepare for months and years, and you have to train, and you have to be ready to be out in the wilderness for days and weeks at a time and be able to survive. Otherwise, if you're ill prepared, you'll end up dying out in the Alaska wilderness. So this lawyer, he basically enters this race, and at some point he ends up helping one of the other contestants because they're having problems, and they basically get into a situation where um, they could die if someone doesn't help them. So he kind of sacrifices his lead in the race in order to help this other participant, and he still ends up finishing. I think he comes in like 13th place at the end. But basically, everyone has a lot of respect for him because even though he didn't come in first place, he was willing to sacrifice, you know, kind of his lead in the race to save this other person. Which, thinking about it, it's like, yeah, the place in the race, like getting first place in the race, doesn't really matter if someone dies. So like there are more important things than winning a competition. So he gains a lot of respect for that. And this woman, this teacher, she slowly kind of starts to fall in love with him, and she actually had another. Oh, see, now I'm getting the characters confused. Yeah, so the lawyer character actually, um, sorry guys, I'm literally just going off of memory. I don't have a script, so if this is all over the place, I apologize. But I really just wanted to get my thoughts down about this book because I think it was an incredible book with lots of different characters and so many cool stories. But basically, this woman, she comes up to Borrow, and at first she is dating this lawyer character, um, and they're thinking about getting married. But then she meets this other guy, and this other guy is the one who raced the Iditarod. And so she's kind of the lawyer, I think, goes down to Anchorage, but the guy who won the not won the Iditarod, the guy who competed in the Iditarod stays in Barrow, and so she's kind of like um, she basically gives the lawyer this ultimatum where she like writes him a letter, and she's like, hey, I know we said we would get married, but you've gone like so far away from me. And just so you know, there's this other guy here that I really like, and he's a potential suitor. So if you wait too long to propose to me, I might just marry this other guy. And then this lawyer, I think, like tries to win her over, and uh, basically this guy who runs the Iditarod, on a group. He ends up on a group with these other scientists that go to this little island glacier in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. It's like a couple hundred miles from Barrow, so it's like literally the furthest north you can go. This group of scientists and this outdoorsman who won the Iditarod, they decide to go further north than that. So they're like on this little glacier island, and this woman, this teacher, she sends him like a telegram or like a radio transmission saying like, hey, if you want to marry me, you should be in Barrow on this date. So the guy, he like flies down from his little glacier, and they get married. And then him and his wife, um, this like self-starting teacher, they go and they live on this glacier together with this other team of scientists. And she kind of provides a little bit of like moral support for the scientists, because it's like they're literally on this glacier alone, and it's like just nice to have like a woman on the glacier to just make conversations more interesting. So it was really cool, and that's just like that's one little story, uh, in the book, and there's like so many other stories like that where Michener, he'll just take some like some like random character, and he'll insert the character into the narrative, and then he'll just over the course of like hundreds of pages, he'll slowly like develop this character, and he'll give them like these interesting stories, and he'll give them like things to do, like they're living breathing people. And I think that's just a sign of a great writer, that he is able to do this, and that he's able to weave such a amazing narrative. So yeah, I know I've rambled on for a while now. I know there were some long moments of silence where I wasn't saying anything because I was kind of scrambling through my book trying to find quotes that I like. But like I said, I didn't really have a script for this video. I just wanted to really share with you guys and talk about this book because I thought it was really amazing. And if anything, it's made me want to read more James Michener books. I definitely want to check out like Hawaii and Tales from the South Pacific. Um, but all of his other books sound really interesting too, like Texas and Centennial, and even the space one. Like that sounds cool. Like he was at one point he was on the advisory board at NASA. So like the novel he wrote about space is literally a history of the space program, which is just so cool. The fact that this guy can write like a 12,000 year history of Alaska, but then he can also write just a history of the space program. Like that's super cool to me, and that I think marks the sign of like just a great writer and a great historian. And I know Michener is considered to be a fiction writer, but honestly, like after reading Alaska and just seeing what his other books are about, I can say that he's a historian as well, because he really cares about his craft, about crafting an interesting story, and bringing all these characters and places to life. So anyways, if you guys did not know who James Michener was, hopefully now you have a bit of a better idea of who he was, what he's about. And I really hope you would check out Alaska. It's an incredible book. And just check out James Michener in general. You don't necessarily have to read Alaska. You can read any other of his number of books. He's written like 50 of them. So by all means, please check them out. They're really worth the read, and just learning to read long form and have developed that kind of patience and that discipline, I think it can really help you, just with it, being able to recall things and with your memory. And it's also just good to learn. You should always be learning. You should always be curious about new things, and you should never feel like you know everything, because the moment you think you know everything, you stop growing. So big takeaway is definitely check out James Michener, and just continue to read, continue to learn, continue to write, and continue to grow. And I thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time. I'm definitely planning on doing more book reviews like this, or just long form discussions where I talk about a book that I'm reading. So if you enjoy this kind of content, as always, stay tuned for more. Bye, guys.